Hey guys, and welcome back. If you've been following along, I've been working through the fundamental concepts that you need to understand to really be successful with Fusion 360 as a manufacturing solution. In this video, I want to talk about some of the disadvantages or perceived disadvantages of a connected CAD/CAM solution. See, I showed you in past videos that when we made a change to the design, our toolpaths could easily be regenerated because the design and the manufacturing were connected. But there's some examples where, as a programmer, I don't want every change from the designer to be instantly updating my toolpaths. And as a designer, I wouldn't want the geometry that a machinist is creating to constantly be added to my design. And I certainly don't want vices wrapped around my assembly, and I'll kind of show you how that happens. So what we're going to do in this video is just walk through some ways that we can create separation between the disciplines of design and manufacturing while still maintaining a connection. I'm going to take a slightly different approach to how I've recorded this video. So in the past, it may have come across as more scripted, and I tried to really condense the content. A few people have reached out to me and suggested that maybe I can take a more conversational approach to the video. It's probably going to drag it out a little bit. And if you find that I've made the video too long and over pivoted in this other direction, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to switch back to the other way of recording. Again, at the end of the day, my intention is to try and help you understand some fundamentals and however that works best for helping you understand that, I'm happy to switch. So looking forward to the comments and feedback on how this is best to understand. So if we dive into it, I've got this pump open, and on the pump, I'm going to work through the process of programming this small end cap. We could program it directly inside of this assembly. And if we did, we could simply switch over to the manufacturing workspace. And when I create a setup for that specific component, it isolates it. Maybe we'll switch back and show all of the components. And we could create another setup and say, maybe this time we're going to create a setup for this other larger end cap. And when we switch between setups, we do a pretty good job of isolating the component that you're machining, and it keeps some clutter from a machining perspective. But if I want to create modeling geometry, I really don't want to do that in this assembly and make a mess of that. So the next thing you might think of is, well, I'm going to open up that small end cap. So let's go ahead and open it. And now we're in a separate document. We're in the document where this end cap was designed. You may even notice that it was designed in the context of the assembly. And Rob Cohey, my colleague, did some great videos showing you how to design this. And we could start working through the process of doing our toolpathing here. But the problem is it's going to start to clutter up the design space. And I'll show you what I mean by that. We're not going to go too far into it, but maybe we start creating a sketch, and we're going to say, you know what, I'm going to do this with a fixture plate. So I start designing my fixture plate. We'll do it rather quickly just to demonstrate. We create a fixture plate, and I extrude that geometry down from my fixture plate. Let's add in all this geometry, and we've got we're starting to get a fixture plate that we know we want to create. And I switch back to my assembly after I've saved it, and pretty soon I start making a complete mess of the assembly when really all I was doing is creating geometry for the purpose of manufacturing. It's just a plate that I was going to make it out of. So that's not the right answer. And you may have seen that, where you end up with vices wrapped all around your assemblies. It's not what we want. So let's switch back here. I'm going to go ahead and delete this feature. We don't need the sketch. We're going to keep Rob's design clean. We don't want to make a mess of Rob's design. But I do want access to all the geometry creation tools. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and say create, and we're going to create a derive. So what derive does is say, let's take this entire component, and I prefer to use the entire component. It's going to make some sense in a minute. I could have just selected a body, but by selecting the entire component, I get all of the geometry that was used and all of the sketches that were used to create this initial design. So I'm going to get some surfaces that were used to control what that extruded up to and all of the sketches. So go ahead and say OK. And we've now inserted this component into a fresh document. I have a fresh document. The very first thing on the timeline is this derive that brought it into this document. I can go ahead and save it, and I'll call this document my small end cap. And just to make sure I remember what this was for, I'll end that with MFG to remember that it's a manufacturing document for the purpose of creating my manufacturing information. So now when I start creating geometry in here, it's going to be specific to this manufacturing document. So we can now move over to our manufacturing space. I'll create my setup in the same way that I did before. A couple tricks while I'm doing this. If we click the stem of this arrow, I can click an edge, and that's going to align my axis. I can also hit the point, and that's going to allow me to pick a reference location. I like to use the bottom left corner. That way I can drop my part on the parallel bars, move it up to a stop, and that's consistent even if I'm running different parts in that same vise. Maybe I'll go to the stock, and on the bottom I'll add 5 millimeters of stock, and that's just for those folks that were commenting in earlier videos, why can't I use millimeters? So there we go. We'll use 5 millimeters of stock on the bottom. Let's start creating some toolpaths. I'm starting to invest some time into this thing. Maybe I'll start with an adaptive clearing toolpath. I'll select a tool, and for my tool library, I'm going to grab a bullnose end mill. The reason I'm using a bullnose end mill is because I really want to get closer to those surfaces, so that works a little better than just a square or flat end mill. So I'll select my bullnose end mill. I'm going to go to my heights tab, and because it's a bullnose end mill, I'm going to move down past the bottom of that part. I just did it by dragging the planes, but you could also enter an equation in here that extends past by the radius of the bull. We'll say OK. I'm going to start adding some finishing strategies, so I'll go around the outside of that part, and again, maybe move past by 0.5 millimeter. I'll machine the inside of this component, again using a 2D contour. In this case, I can add a few extra roughing passes. Doesn't matter if I add too many, I'll say 10. And it's going to trim the excess roughing strategy or passes that aren't needed. I did get a little warning, and that warning would have just told me that it trimmed some of those tool paths. But again, it's not the focus of this video, so let's keep going. I'd like to go ahead and engrave that text. So we'll go ahead and use an engrave toolpath. I'll select my tool for engraving. And when I select my geometry, instead of picking these edges individually, and I could do that, we're going to expand out and now make use of the geometry that was created for that initial command. So we can expand out our tree, get all the way down into our sketches that were used, and we can see there's this sketch that created the text. I'm going to go ahead and make that visible, and then we can select that text that was used to create the PUMCO. And what you're going to find later is I'll acknowledge the fact that this was a mistake that I made purposely to demonstrate something. I made this mistake. I'd love to blame Rob, but this was me putting a mistake in to show you. So we'll go ahead and create that toolpath. I'm now getting to the point where I really want to start creating this surfacing toolpath. And for the surfacing toolpath, there's a few different toolpaths we could use, but I personally know that a morph toolpath, I think a morph toolpath would look real good on the top of that part. But I don't want to morph from this edge down to that one. It's going to create some kind of interesting collapse marks. I really want it to look a little smoother, and so I'm going to create some construction geometry for that. So I'll come back over to my design environment. We're going to show the planes that I actually just hid, but I'll create a sketch on top of this plane, and we're going to start creating some construction geometry. So let's get this in here close. I might want to look at my past sketches that were created. So if we look at the layout from before, I can now make a reference, and maybe I'll project 2 of these points. And in this case, I will use a slot command. I'm going to do a center to center slot. So we'll create a slot from there to there and come out and maybe make that 0.5. And then we're going to do a second time. If I use my mouse gestures, I can come up and just recreate that, or I could also come and do slot again. We'll go click, click, come up, and enter a width for that. So we've now got some sketch geometry. The other beautiful thing here is I've got the geometry already that was used to model the part. So we can finish this. I'll come back into my manufacturing space. We saw all the toolpaths go dirty, even though this sketch has nothing to do with the rest of the part. If you stick around to the end of the video, I'll give you a sneak peek of what's coming. But for now, I'm going to then create a morphed spiral toolpath. We're going to do a few unique things here. First and foremost, for my model, I'll do an override that also includes this extra geometry, so the toolpath is driving off of that geometry so that it doesn't plunge into the holes. And then I'll contain it using a selection of those 2 edges. And this is going to give me a much nicer surface finish. On my passes tab, let's drop that pass down to 0.5 millimeter. And on my tool, I'm going to go ahead and select my ball and mill. So, I thought I changed the step over. We can change that again quickly though. We'll say edit. We'll go to the step over and make that step over 0.5. There we go. So you can see that this construction geometry I created makes for a nice, clean, beautiful toolpath. Maybe I'll even hide that other surface body. I don't need it anymore. So we leveraged the geometry that Rob had created to machine over top of those surfaces, but I'm also creating some additional geometry that's necessary for me to get this nice clean toolpath. But I did it inside of my manufacturing document. There's no need for me to do it, or not actually no need. I really didn't want to do it in the design document because the engineer Rob doesn't really want me to make a mess of his timeline. And what's worse, we really don't want this kind of stuff happening, which when I regenerate here, we'll clean up those mistakes that I'd made before. So I don't see these initial sketches. We're back to this clean version of the component. If I pop over here, this clean version of the component in the way that Rob had done it. But what happens, and let's just regenerate this toolpath, sorry. We'll regenerate this toolpath. So we know we have a nice clean part. But now I get to the point where I was, you know what? There's a spelling mistake on there. We need to change this to Pumpco. And really, Rob should have added some fillets in these corners. I know Rob knows better. Again, these design changes I did on purpose to demonstrate this. We want to add some fillets in those corners so the tool can roll in there nicely. Do we still get the advantage of this connected CAD/CAM experience, or are we going to be back to the old days of me having to start over? Well, the truth is, I come back to this design. I'll start with the simple sketch change. So let's expand out the sketch. Let's edit that sketch. I'm going to double click Pumpco and make that Pumpco and finish the sketch. So we've updated our extrude there. I'll also make some changes on the fillets. So we'll go ahead and add these fillets. You can see I'm selecting directly through the model, which is kind of nice. I'll create that as a 10 millimeter fillet, and we can say OK. And now, when I save my document, actually, maybe I'm not going to save it. I'll cancel the save. I haven't saved the document yet. When I come over to my manufacturing document, I look here. What I want you to notice is not what happened, but what hasn't happened. There's no indication that anything has changed yet. I'll come back over here, and now Rob has said, okay, I've finished those changes. I'm going to click Save. And when he saves the document, then I come to my manufacturing document. And now I see, okay, there's an update that's happened. I'll simply consume those updates. And the model is updated with the changes, but inside of my document, the document I have full control of, where I can add to the timeline with my manufacturing specific information. Of course, if we move over to the manufacturing environment, we see that the toolpaths have gone dirty. And when I regenerate those toolpaths, they're going to update accordingly. And I think what's even more impressive or interesting is this engraving operation. Because I selected the entire text, it's even updated with the additional letters. If I look at my contouring operation, it's again updated accordingly to include, if I get the right one here, to include the fillets that we've added. So in this way, I've got all of the benefits of connected design and manufacturing, but I've got my own document. In this document, I can control my own saving. When I save this a second time, I say toolpaths, maybe started, but not done yet. And I can continue to save my document separately than when Rob is saving his design document. I have control over my manufacturing document, but I still have a link to the design document, and I can consume those changes that Rob makes when necessary. So I hope that helps you understand some of the advantages that you can take in separating your documents out to maintain the connective tissue that's powerful, but also introduce some what we might call gates in the process to make sure that we're keeping the manufacturing information clean and separated from the design information, and really controlling when that information flows and giving you control over it. So I told you if you stuck around, I'd share a few details about what we're working on that thematically tie into what we've been talking about today. And what we've been talking about today is how do we create separation between our design, our engineering documents, and our manufacturing documents while still keeping a connective tissue to that design. When the design changes, I want to update it, and I still want access to all of those powerful modeling tools that are useful when I'm doing my manufacturing. So we've seen how we create those connections, but we're really trying to push forward on how we create better connections and more intelligence to how that happens. And at one point, I made a simple model change that invalidated all of the toolpaths, even though the model change was very specific to a small set of geometry. So you saw my screen jump a little bit when I started this second part of the conversation. That's because I've now enabled some functionality we're working on. I'm not going to make any claims as to when it's going to be released, but I want to point you in the direction of what we're thinking about. And so what I'm going to do is come back over to my design space. I'm going to go to that sketch that I created, and I'm going to make a change to that sketch. Let's just make a small change and tighten up that containment boundary so that it's a little closer and there's not quite as much cutting that rolls over the edge. We'll finish that sketch. We're going to come back to our manufacturing space. And what's happened quite beautifully and elegantly is we've only invalidated the toolpath that is making use of that specific sketch geometry. We haven't invalidated any of the other toolpaths because we didn't change any of the geometry that's driving those toolpaths. So now I can simply say, let's regenerate that toolpath. And it actually even goes a step further than that. So let's make another quick change. I'll go back to my design space. I'm going to edit that sketch again, and I'm actually going to create some additional sketch geometry in that sketch. We'll come to our manufacturing space, and we haven't invalidated the toolpath at all because this additional sketch geometry isn't used to drive the toolpath. So I hope that helps inspire you. I hope that helps you see how we're thinking about these details of connecting things together, connecting things so they update appropriately, but allowing you to introduce gates into that process and decide when you want the toolpath to update, when you want to consume the model changes, the design changes, and when you don't. And also, how do we start becoming more intelligent about when a design change really needs to update a manufacturing document? Of course, we want you to have full confidence that if a design change happens, you don't make an incorrect part, but we also don't want the toolpath to be constantly updating. Again, I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I took a slightly different approach to how this video is recorded, a little bit more conversational that dragged the video on quite a bit longer than some of the past videos where I was able to stay a lot more focused. Did you find this format helpful? Certainly was a lot easier for me to record, but if the other method is easier for you to learn and the condensed time frame is helpful for you in learning, I'm more than happy to invest the time for you. I'd love to hear in the comments below if the content was useful and how this change and how I've delivered the content is or isn't a help. And again, have a great long weekend. Talk to you next time.